Hello everyone. Today I'd like to talk about what mid-tier battles in War Thunder Naval are like. I've already covered the high-tier ones, but I think most players will end up playing in the mid-tiers as you can fairly quickly zip through the early tiers if you are somewhat skilled. And the mid-tiers are where you're going to start having to slow down, learn the game, the grinds get a little bit longer, the ships are a little bit more weird, and the gameplay overall slows down, so it'll take you a little bit longer to get through these, and I think it's where a lot of players are going to be stuck for a little bit. So I'd like to cover what those battles are like, and then people can compare that to the high tier battles. Before I get into it, I do want to mention that the background footage is not high tier before somebody points it out, or not mid tier, sorry, before somebody points it out to me. It is a fairly high tier match, but I just wanted to show that the things I'm going to discuss in this video also go for high tier, as the ship I'm playing isn't super good, as you'll probably see in the background, and the server doesn't exactly hold up sometimes, as the first replay I tried to record, which is also the one playing in the background, the server just decided to crash, which seems to happen every couple of battles, so I'm not sure why War Thunder has this problem still. But regardless, let's get into what mid-tier is like, as my battle is not that important. So, just to put everything into perspective, this is mostly going to pertain to blue water ships. Coastals will be mentioned, but they're not the gist of what I play. And most of my experience is with the arcade battle mode, rather than realistic. The mid-tier will be qualified as rank 3 to 4 ships, comprised of mostly battle rating 4.7 to 5.7 with a few outliers. There's a few ships mixed in there that are above or below said battle ratings. These battle ratings are mostly the late war destroyers, and they transitioned into the early cruisers, more so the light variety rather than the heavy variety. And it also covers the treaty cruisers and treaty busting cruisers in some nations, and those tend to form the end of the mid-tiers on all the lines. These cruisers overall tend to be the weirder, or like I said, more restricted designs for each nation, and it causes them to struggle when they do get up-tiered, just because of their design limitations, their armor limitations, and so on and so forth. And while the ships are a little bit weirder and they suffer in up-tiers, the actual dichotomy of these battles is fairly similar to top tier, where destroyers can bully the early cruisers just with their rate of fire and their maneuverability, and because they're a lot more modern, but they tend to get decimated by the later cruisers, and the later cruisers can bully around early battleships, but if they get up tiered into the later battleships and battle cruisers, they basically get trounced on. So it's a very similar dichotomy to what you see at top tier. These are also the battle ratings where the skill curve comes into play a little bit more, as the cruisers will have a lower rate of fire than a lot of destroyers, and aiming for the magazines or critical components with armor piercing is more rewarding, as you'll just decimate the cruisers overall and normally just blow them up. And this is to compare to the low tier rapid fire high explosive spam between destroyers, where you're knife fighting and you're just trying to drain down the enemy's crew before yours gets drained down. The lower rates of fires with these cruisers also punishes missing shots more, but does reward dodging more, as the enemy player obviously will have to go through his whole reload without getting any damage on you. So the skill curve comes into play a little bit more per just aiming and dodging successfully and getting your damage down range. There are a few exceptional ships at these ranks that tend to dominate matches, and they'll basically be at the top of the leaderboard if the player kinda knows what they're doing. And some easy ones to notice are the Atlanta, the Admiral Hipper class, and to some extent like Graf Spee. I'm sure there's some Russian cruisers I could stick in here, and maybe some of the France ones, but I don't have a ton of experience with those yet, so I can't exactly say which ones are the outliers, but definitely the Atlanta and the Admiral Hippers are pretty dominant at these tiers. As far as the actual matches, many players will still try to rush in and brawl in these battles, even if they are on a larger map, which, takes them a long time to get to those cap zones or the enemy players, and this causes the objectives to be captured much more often than the high tier matches. This does, however, tend to get the ships that are just rushing headlong into battle pretty much devastated, as the player's aiming level at this point is a little bit better, and the heavier guns on a lot of these ships are just more destructive overall, so those poor little destroyers that are rushing in to try to get to the cap zones early on don't exactly make it out too well usually. This is also where you will see some players sit back and lob shells from spawn a little bit more. It's not as prevalent as high tiers, but you'll see some players start to do it, even if their ships aren't good at that, just due to shell velocities or rates of fire or damage overall, or their aim isn't quite up to par yet, so they're not much more than a nuisance. And players will still tend to sail in straight lines and not change their speed. This is where you'll start to encounter the minority of players that will actively take, evasive action. But for a large majority of these players, sailing in a straight line is still their thing. They're still trying to get their aiming down, so if they start to maneuver, it kind of throws them off quite significantly. And these are also the battle ratings where your ship's armor tends to come into play a little bit more, especially if you have one of the treaty busting cruisers, I guess you could call them, or something like the Aoba, which I'm not sure if that's treaty busting or not. I'll have to go remind myself after this. But the ship's armor does come into play a little bit more. You have the ability to take shots and bounce them, or at least negate a lot of their damage. And even stuff like light cruisers like Atlanta, they have armor on them that is fairly resistant to destroyer fire. So a lot of the lower tier ships will really struggle to deal any real damage to you, which when you do use this to your advantage is pretty enjoyable. You feel like a battleship even though you have, rapid fire 127s or something. And some players will remember to use this to their advantage, but a lot of players, like I said, they'll sail in a straight line, fully broadside, and their armor's basically worthless if you know where to aim. And speaking of which, certain treaty cruisers, the US cruisers, if you know where their weak spots are, other than, the whole ship entirely, and obviously if you know your aim very well, they're very easy to take out, and you'll see some players take full advantage of this and just devastate the treaty cruisers with just a destroyer or something like that. So it's an interesting dichotomy of ships that are actually getting armor values and ships that are basically the all or nothing builds that, if you throw a rock at them hard enough, they're going to get penetrated. Kind of going back to my point of players lobbing shells from spawn, this is also where you'll get that minute handful of players that will try to revenge kill. Kind of like just firing from spawn. You won't see this as much as you do in the high tier matches, but a handful of players will still try to. The lower shell velocities of these ships makes it a lot harder for them, and the fact that the shells usually aren't as devastating definitely makes it a lot harder. And a lot of these players are still trying to learn to aim, so it's not as prevalent as high tiers and not as dangerous, but it still exists. Now, getting away from the blue water ships for a moment, coastal vessels do get encountered in these matches quite frequently, as players are still spawning them to actually go after points, especially points with a lot of islands. And really, they're kind of just food for blue water ships at this tier. There's a few outliers, but in a lot of cases the destroyers will just absolutely decimate them, or the cruisers will get one shell onto them and absolutely nuke them. Unlike top tiers where they can terrorize battleships, it's not as easy for them in these matches, mostly because it's not big open matches with very slow moving ships. The ships tend to be faster, they tend to be able to see them, they have faster fire rates than the battleships, and the matches just tend to be closer in nature, so the destroyers tend to get in there, compete for objectives, and then just see the blue water ship. or not the blue water, sorry, the coastal ships and just destroy them. Along those lines, planes are fairly prevalent in these matches. It's not as prevalent as the low tier matches where players are just spawning them because they can, but they are still fairly devastating if they do get through the flak of, you know, any late war destroyers or certain cruisers that do have anti-aircraft abilities. But if they do find a ship that doesn't have said anti-aircraft, or if they do manage to weave through them, their bombs will either heavily damage or outright sink most ships, just because of the lighter nature of these cruisers, or just due to how they're built. Like I said, some cruisers and destroyers do have extremely effective anti-aircraft, but a lot of players will still tend to crash bomb the first ship they see. So yes, planes can be devastating, but it's not as much as low tiers where you don't have the anti-aircraft, and where one player just flying around not crash bombing the first ship they see can basically single-handedly win the match. They have fairly, I don't want to say limited effectiveness, but more limited than low tiers. And kind of similar to high tiers, but you know, more planes because people are still spawning them. Overall, these matches still have a lot of the chaos of the low tier games, but they're slowed down due to the slower ship speeds, the lower rate of fire, the larger map sizes that are encountered, but a glimmer of structure does start to appear as more players are seen using the skills they have learned from the lower tiers to their own advantage rather than just rushing into knife fight the enemy team. They'll use the aim they've learned. They'll use their armor, they'll use their evasive actions, and they might not just bum rush a cap and go try to knife fight the first enemy they see, staying broadside the whole time. But I'd be curious to see if anybody else has different opinions on what mid-tier is like, as this is kind of what I've seen when I'm grinding my battles. I'd be curious to see what anybody else thinks. Anyway guys, I hope you'd enjoyed, good luck out there, and I'll see you next time.